Today I'm going to show you how to make Chelsea buns. These are an enriched bread dough. The ingredients I'm going to need for the base of the dough and the ingredients I'm going to need for filling the dough later. I'm going to start by making the base. So in my bowl I've got my strong plain flour. I'm going to add into it my yeast. I'm also going to add into it half a teaspoon of salt. I'll tell you a little bit about why I have the ingredients in just a moment. So in goes my salt, keeping the salt away from the yeast so it doesn't kill it. And then I'm going to stir those round and I'm going to add into it a very small amount of butter or hard margarine. And the first thing is going to be to actually rub that in. So I'm going to cut my butter up just into small pieces. And then I'm going to rub it in until it looks like breadcrumbs. So with all bread doughs, we've used a strong plain flour. The reason for that is that it's got a higher gluten content. And if you remember, gluten is the protein that's made when the gliadin and the glutenin that's actually in the flour get hydrated. So when the liquid goes into it, those two proteins together form the gluten, which is the word we tend to use when we're talking about proteins in flour. And we want lots of protein in there so that we have a strong dough so that it will withstand all of the kneading and the stretching that we're going to do with it. So when you're happy then that you've got it rubbed in, shake your bowl, make sure you've got no more big lumps of butter in there. And then the next thing you're going to need is some hand hot liquid. Now this is an enriched dough. You would have noticed that the butter went in. So this time I'm going to add milk into it. So I have pre-warmed my milk in the microwave. It took about 40 seconds. And I'm going to quickly stir it in just with a table knife, adding probably about 2/3 of it to start with, and mixing it round to see if I can get it to clump together. It's important to do this quickly, but to add in the milks fairly gradually, just so that you don't end up in a big sticky mess to start with. And because there's very little fat, it actually takes quite a lot of liquid, and that's still not there, so I'm going to add in all of that I've got sitting around. If you suddenly find that you haven't got enough liquid, then a little bit of warm water is fine, because you've still got a fairly rich dough. I think I'm just going to need a tiny bit more. Okay, so the mixture started to clump together. So it's fairly sort of a craggy mixture at the moment, but what we need to do is to keep going until we get a smooth mixture. So keep dribbling in the water if you need to. And you want to clean out the bowl. That's the sort of consistency you're after, enough to pick up all of the bits of dough that are actually in there. Okay, next stage then is to knead it. Now, depending on what your texture is like, will depend on whether or not you need any flour on the surface. You actually want to add the minimum amount of flour that you possibly can, so that you don't end up spoiling the recipe. And you're going to have to knead this for a good 5 minutes until the mixture is nice and soft and stretchy and elastic. And those of you who watch the TV programmes will realise that once it's done, you should be able to stretch it out a bit, and you can do this thing called a window pane. In other words, you can almost see through the mixture because it is so soft. So just recapping then on the ingredients that we had. So I've explained to you about the strong plain flour. The yeast, as you would know, is the raising agent in the Chelsea buns. And when that gets combined with the mixture and you add the water in there and the food in there, eventually that will produce carbon dioxide and alcohol, and it will help your bread to rise, okay? Or your bread dough, your Chelsea buns, it doesn't matter, whatever the yeast mixture is. Now I use the quick fast action yeast because it's instant. If you're using fresh yeast or one of the yeasts that's dried but it's not instant, you have to actually mix it with a little bit of warm water and leave it till it goes frothy, and then you use it in your mixture. Just takes a little bit longer, but it's absolutely fine. The fat that I had today was butter, Sometimes you'll know that we use oil, okay? And what that does is it gives this a nice soft dough. The butter will give it a tiny little bit of colour, and it also makes them last longer. It increases the shelf life, so it's enriching the dough. The salt, as you know, gives it a flavour, but it also slows down the action of the yeast and makes the gluten a little bit stronger. So it's important to have a little bit in there. Too much salt though will kill the yeast. And when you've got your mixture weighed out, try and keep the salt and the yeast away from each other until you're actually ready to mix them together. So that covers all of the ingredients in the dough. So what's happening now then is that we're gradually kneading this, and the yeast is beginning to work, and it's beginning to form pockets of air in the dough. I finished kneading my dough. It's had 5 minutes, and it's now, you can see, a fairly smooth, soft ball. I didn't end up having to have any flour on the work surface. The consistency of it was fine. And because I've actually got time to spare now, which you may or may not have, I'm actually going to leave mine to rise for a little bit. So I'm going to put it back into my clean mixing bowl. I'm going to cover it with some cling film, and then I'm going to leave it until it increases in size a little bit. And then I'm going to do the shaping bit. If you haven't got time, then that's fine, but you'll need to give it a good rise after you've actually done the shaping. I've got the dough now that I left for its initial rising, and it has increased in size a little bit. So what I'm going to do is to get that ready now to roll out to shape. Okay. I also, however, need to make sure that I've got my filling ready. So the butter that I had earlier, I have now melted in the microwave for 40 seconds. I've got my dried fruit, I've got my sugar, and I've got my spices. Now I'm choosing to use cinnamon and mixed spice. You may prefer to use one or neither of them. So I'm going to go with half a teaspoon of each. Now I'm actually going to mix mine into the sugar, because I just think there's a better chance then of spreading it slightly more evenly when it comes to spreading it on the dough later. So I'm just going to mix that around a little bit so that I've now got like a cinnamon flavoured sugar. Okay, I can put this to one side then. Because the first stage is going to be to roll out the dough. So this time I actually do need some flour on the surface, regardless of how easy the dough is going to be to shape. So I need to have it about the size of an A4 sheet. So in other words, where we normally have like a plastic wallet with recipes in, we need it to be roughly that sort of size. Now the first rising that I had would have allowed the yeast to produce carbon dioxide and some alcohol. That's why you get the smell that you have with this. By knocking it back, if you like, now, in other words reshaping it, I'm going to be reducing the size of those air bubbles so that hopefully the finished dough will have a light texture, but it will have smaller air bubbles actually into it, and that's what we actually want. When it's cooked then, the oven is going to encourage more fermentation of the yeast and more carbon dioxide and alcohol to be produced. Right, I'm almost there. So that's my dough size. I'm just going to tiny little bit bigger, and then I'm going to spread out the filling mixture. Okay, so first on then is going to go the melted butter. Now if you've got a pastry brush, you can use a pastry brush. I'm not going to use a pastry brush because I know that everybody hasn't got one at home. So instead I have melted my butter, and I'm just going to carefully spread it over the top with a knife. A nice, much easier to wash than a pastry brush that's had fat on it. Okay, that's that bit done. Next I'm going to sprinkle onto it my cinnamon and mixed spice sugar. That was quite a lot, but remember this is a plain dough. Okay, it didn't have sugar added into the mixture or anything. Okay, that's that bit. And then finally, I'm going to put on my dried fruit. Now I've got a mixture of sultanas and dried apricots. Okay, you can see now that I have spread the filling evenly, and the next stage is going to be rolling this up like a Swiss roll. Okay, so my dough is ready. I'm going to roll it over along the long side to the edge, squish that down, and then I'm going to get then my tin that I'm going to cook it in. Now if you haven't got something like this, a normal everyday sandwich tin that you would make a cake in would be fine, but if it's a nice tin, you might want to just line it with a tiny bit of baking parchment, because the mixture, the buttery sugary mixture, tends to turn a little bit caramelly, and sometimes it can stick to the bottom of the tin. You don't want to spoil your cake tins, so that would be a good idea. If it's something like this, it's disposable, then it doesn't really matter. You can get rid of it afterwards. So I'm going to get my sharp knife and I'm going to cut now about 9 of these. So I'm going to roughly mark it into thirds so that I've got an idea about the size. And then using my knife very carefully on the surface, because you don't want to cut through your work surface with your sharp knife, I'm going to cut these into pieces. And then as they go into the tin then, you can reshape them. So there are my pieces that I've cut, and I'm now going to put them into the tray. There they are in the tin. I've had to reshape them slightly, because as you cut through them they tend to go a little bit more rectangular. And I'm now going to cover them and then leave them until they double in size. Now this can take 45 minutes, an hour, but it's important to get the rising stage good at this stage. The Chelsea buns have now had about an hour doing the proving, and you can see that they've risen now so that they almost fill the tin. It's important that when they go into the oven they go onto a baking tray if your container has got holes in the bottom of it, because sometimes the sugary buttery mixture comes out of the bottom of the tin and you don't really want it all over the bottom of the oven. So they're now going to go into a hot oven at 200 degrees for about 20 minutes until they go nicely brown. The Chelsea buns have come out of the oven, and you can see now that they're a rich golden brown colour. The next stage for me is going to be to put them onto a plate, and then I'm going to melt some golden syrup in the microwave for 20 seconds and then brush it onto the surface. So they're here on the plate, and I've melted the golden syrup and got a pastry brush to spread the syrup over the surface. And there they are, the finished glossy result of the well-risen Chelsea buns. The option is also there for you to use a glacé icing to drizzle over the surface instead of the golden syrup, but that choice is yours.